Yes, we can start.
Hello, am I audible? Yes. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, sir. Welcome to the 94th IDG session with Mr. Dhruva Jaishankar, who is the head of the US initiative at ORF. I would request Aditi Singh to come and introduce the guest for all the attendees.
Thank you, Yathansh. Good evening, everyone. I, Aditi Singh, the co-convener of IDG, would take the privilege of welcoming you to the 94th informal discussion session. With us today, we have Mr. Dhruva Jaishankar, Director of the US Initiative at ORF. From 2012 to 2016, at German Marshall Fund in Washington, D.C., he managed the Indian Trilateral Forum, a policy dialogue involving participants from India, Europe, and the US. He has been a David Rockefeller Fellow with the Trilateral Commission. Mr. Jaishankar regularly contributes to Indian and international media on security and international affairs. So we'll be speaking on the topic India, US, and China in 2020 and beyond. Now I would request Mr. Yathansh to take over the mic. Thank you.
Okay. Without further ado, we would request Mr. Dhruva to begin with his lecture for all of us. Before that, I would request all the attendees that in case anyone has any questions, they can post them on the chat box, and I will convey the questions of yours to Mr. Dhruva.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for that introduction. I very much appreciate the opportunity to interact with students and young professionals from across India. In fact, between 2016 and 2019, I was based in Delhi with Brookings India, and at that time, I tried to spend a lot of time going to many places, including Calcutta, to interact with students there. So I hope we can make this as informal and a discussion-oriented dialogue. I'd be happy to answer questions on anything that might be of interest to you. So I'll keep my remarks quite brief. We are at an interesting time, I think, for India as a country and for India's place in the world. Of course, we all of us are feeling the effects directly or indirectly of the coronavirus pandemic. I'm currently in Washington in the US, which is still seeing a very large number of cases. And of course, in India, we're seeing a growing daily number of cases as well. Secondly, there are natural economic consequences for all of this. Again, directly or indirectly affecting almost everyone. So a lot of people, unfortunately, have lost their jobs and livelihood. There'll be hope that various major economies and even small countries can rebound successfully from what will undoubtedly be a setback, and in many cases a recession triggered by the coronavirus pandemic. All of this also comes at a time when there are many changes, of course, domestically in India, unrelated to the economy, and there's also national security is also at the forefront of people's attention today, particularly given the continuing standoff between India and China along their disputed boundary. So with this backdrop, I think it's no better time to be discussing India's relations with China and the United States today and in the years, the past, the present, and the future of these two relationships. In some ways, they will be India's two most important international relations. Of course, and I would, in addition to India's very important relations with its neighborhood as well, which I think deserves equal and perhaps more attention sometimes. But amongst the major powers, I think China and the United States are the two driving factors in some ways of India's overall orientation. They are India's two largest trade partners in recent years. They are, in some ways, the two largest drivers of its security orientation, along with Russia. So I think it's all the more important then to look at these relationships. Broadly speaking, and I'll be very brief in this, I think the India-China relationship has traditionally been composed of four elements. One is the boundary dispute, and this is something that started in the 1950s when, following China's annexation of Tibet in 1951, 1950, 1951. And in the late 1950s, I think the differences over the alignment of the boundary became more and more of a issue between the two countries. There was previously a misunderstanding that it was a non-issue, but particularly following the Indian discovery of a Chinese-built road in Aksai Chin, this came to the forefront for several reasons, and I can go into it in more detail. It ultimately led to the boundary conflict of 1962. This really led to a suspension of normal full-level diplomatic contacts and other forms of engagement between India and China until the 1970s, when there was a partial move towards normalization, which this accelerated after 1988, 1989, following Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China. But basically, since the late 1980s up to 2013, we saw the two countries move towards establishing various arrangements and understandings on how to manage the boundary. This was seen as a partial step towards settling the boundary dispute, but the further steps on exchanging maps and exchanging details on have not proceeded subsequently. Also in 2013, I think it was a pivotal point because we saw for the first major boundary standoff between India and China since the Samdorongchu incident of the mid-1986-87. And so for the first time in Depsang, in Ladakh, we saw a standoff between Indian and Chinese forces. The Chinese side set up tents in an ability to change the status quo on the ground. We saw similar incidents in 2014 and 2015, a minor one 2015 as well. And then, of course, in 2017, we saw separately, and in some ways this was a bit of an anomaly, the Doklam standoff, which involved Bhutan, sort of a very different sector of the India-China dispute. Subsequently now, in 2020, we've seen a major mobilization by the Chinese forces in Ladakh and the continuing standoff there. So this, I think, is the first element. There's been a bilateral security competition. There's also been a regional security competition, which is Chinese concerns in India about Chinese influence in India's neighborhood, extending primarily earlier to Pakistan, which in 1976, China and Pakistan entered into an agreement to share nuclear technology and subsequently missile technology as well. But there's also been different kinds of arrangements with Bangladesh, which is a major recipient, remains a major recipient of Chinese military equipment from the 1980s onwards, with Sri Lanka, which is a major source of investment, destination of Chinese investment and loans, which have had a security implication. And more recently, Nepal, where particularly the political relationship between the leaderships in China and Nepal has grown much closer. These have resulted periodically, and it's not necessarily just a new thing. There have been episodes in the past, in the 70s and 80s, when India had very serious reservations about the relationship some of its neighboring countries were having with China. And this has required India at various times to engage with those countries, to sometimes it's led to deteriorations in relations with those countries. And in some ways, with the exception of Bhutan, and even there have been some slight forms of engagement now, particularly Chinese tourists to Bhutan. In the Maldives, we've seen major Chinese financing going there and political support for the now former leader. Myanmar, where China is very much involved in brokering an accord between this has been a second point of general concern by India when it comes to China. There are two other areas which I think over the last 20 years or so, India and China had become accustomed to a sense of cooperation. And one was in the multilateral sphere. So India and China working together in global to shape global governance on whether it's in BRICS or the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, whether it was on climate change. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So there are a number of initiatives where India and China were actually working together, mostly to ensure that both as large growing economies had a growing voice in determining international outcomes and international institutions. In that area, we have seen a change in the last few years, where suddenly China has abandoned this rhetoric of rising powers, not just with India, but with others as well, and is now projecting itself as a superpower, as a rival pole to the United States in the world. So to give just one notable example, BRICS came up several times when Xi Jinping first became secretary of the Chinese Communist Party in 2012, 2013. He would repeatedly refer to how important BRICS was. 5 years later, when in 2017, 2018, you saw that abandoned in favor of a much more unilateral vision of China's leadership role in the world. A fourth area of the relationship, and again, a second cooperative area, has been on the economic and trade front. And basically from 2003 to 2018-19, we saw much, particularly the first decade of that until 2012, we saw a huge surge in China-India trade. What happened over time, though, is I think the belief that China would also evolve into a more market-based economy became undermined. And so Indian companies which were previously very optimistic about working with China suddenly became much more skeptical. That they found that even though incomes in China were growing, these same companies were competitive in the US and Europe and Australia and in the Gulf, but were not getting the kind of market access in China. And the trade deficit widened significantly just 2 years ago. It was about $60 billion US, which was about the same as India's entire defense budget. So, if you think of it that way, India was actually importing from China, buying from China on net as much as it was spending on its entire defense budget. So basically, these two areas of competition with China have accelerated over the last few years on the boundary, as China's infrastructure has become better, as it has undertaken military reforms itself, and on the one hand, and then on regional security as well, you've seen a greater competition as China's resources, as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, have started being exported overseas. Again, these concerns have been there for some time, but China's resources to actually play a role, particularly an economic role in India's neighborhood and the Indian Ocean region, has increased significantly. So the two areas of competition have intensified. The two areas of cooperation have reached, in some ways, their natural limits. Largely, I would argue that as a consequence of decisions China has made to abandon sort of true multilateralism on the one hand, so cooperative multilateralism, and on the second, not evolve into a market economy as many had hoped. So all of this suggests that we are in a period of, and again, the coronavirus pandemic and the boundary standoff have accelerated these trends in some ways, or brought them into a sharper focus. But we're in a period for much more intensified India-China competition going forward. And I think we have to contend with what that means. And in some ways, the gradual decoupling of the Indian economy from China and the app bans are indicative of this, but also the stopping public procurement from China, or at least having greater scrutiny of public procurement. I think there's a strong indication that Chinese companies will not be able to compete in the Indian technology sector. These, I think, are signs of what is to come, particularly if the other conditions hold that I described. So I think understanding that we're in for a much more competitive relationship with China, what does that mean? What opportunities does that open or close for India internationally and domestically as it rebuilds its economy after the coronavirus pandemic? These are the questions that should animate us going forward. Let me shift a little bit to the US, and I think there is a strong connection between India's China relationship and India's relationship with the US. The US relationship has traditionally been quite difficult, although sometimes the difficulties are overstated. After 1947, there was a very strong outreach to the United States. Pandit Nehru, India's first prime minister, spent quite a bit of time here in the US on his maiden visit. He was greeted by President Truman when he arrived. So a very warm relationship. For a period of time, there were shared concerns about Chinese communist expansionism, and so you saw intelligence and security cooperation in the 1950s, even some talk of nuclear cooperation, which didn't fully materialize. And this intensified after the 1962 war for a brief period until 1965. And sometimes this history is forgotten, I think, because of events that took place subsequently. For a period of time, India was the single largest recipient of American aid as well in the early 1960s. Since then, starting 1965 with the India-Pakistan war, where the US took a very even-handed position, much to I think India's disappointment, and then particularly following the 1971 Bangladesh war, where the US sided very much with Pakistan and China, partly because it was driven by a desire to have a closer relationship with those two countries as a hedge against the Soviet Union. India entered consequently into an agreement, a treaty of peace and friendship with the Soviet Union, with Moscow in 1971. So in some ways that marked a low point of the India-US relationship. And while periodic attempts were made in the late 70s and the 1980s by Morarji Desai, by Indira Gandhi, and subsequently Rajiv Gandhi, to try and put the relationship back on a more even keel, it was politically difficult. I think just as there was a desire by both Washington and New Delhi to fix the relationship, you had the Afghan war, and that led again to a greater US emphasis on Pakistan and a desire to cooperate with Pakistan on that front. So again, you saw a sort of relationship that didn't quite come together. The big change occurred after 1998, after India's nuclear tests. And initially, the US led the world in imposing sanctions on India after the tests. But in a series of negotiations between 1998 and 2000, effectively decided to drop those sanctions on India, at least those imposed in 98 itself. And that dialogue actually helped to broker a more cooperative political relationship that subsequent governments, both in India and the United States, so while it started under the Vajpayee government in India and the Clinton administration in the US, subsequent governments actually took that forward. So governments of both Manmohan Singh and Narendra Modi after 2004. To end for 2014, and then in the US side on by George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and even Donald Trump. So we've seen in some ways the 98 tests again as another crisis point that actually eventually led to cooperation. I don't think many people could have anticipated that level of cooperation 15, 20 years down the line. But in some ways the key determinant was to for the US to treat India as a de facto nuclear state, which is allow India to retain its nuclear weapons program, but receive all the benefits that the 5 recognized nuclear powers would get. And that was essentially what the India-US Civil Nuclear Agreement was about, which was first agreed in 2005, concluded in 2008. That in some ways opened the doors to a level of defense cooperation that India and the US enjoy today that they would not otherwise have. And today, effectively, India is treated, from a legal point of view and from a policy point of view, almost on par, in some cases on par with formal US allies. So this has been, the broadly constructive direction of the relationship. While this is what's happened on the political level, in some ways the bigger story is what's happened on the economic and on the social level between the two countries. So even when relations between India and the US were not very good in the 1970s and 1980s, you saw after 1965, after the US changed its immigration policy, a steady stream of Indians emigrating to the United States, sometimes as students, sometimes as professionals, such as doctors. But that has slowly led over time to what is now a sizable, depending on how you measure it, about 3 million strong Indian American community. They are, by some measures, depending on how you measure it, the best educated and best and wealthiest per capita community in the US. And they've become increasingly politically active as well. And in many cases, I think this simple fact means that for many Indians in India who have family in the US or have friends in the US or people they know who've studied there and sometimes return to India, surprisingly, in India, the US remains extremely popular, even at times when much of the rest of the world opinion of the US has soured. So after the Iraq war in 2003, after Donald Trump's election, we saw dips in public opinion views of the United States around the world. India, while there was some fluctuation, it has remained consistently quite high. And surveys also suggest that Indians continue to think of the US as the primary land of opportunity. The largest number of Indian students going abroad still go to the US. So I think, in some ways we tend to take that for granted. That there's an Indian American community, they've emigrated. Why is that an issue? But it continues to act as a very important bridge between the two countries, and sometimes in a way that is not captured in formal metrics of international relations. It's not captured in trade figures or investment figures, but there are levels of cooperation that exist between the peoples that remains very important between the two countries, and sometimes in a non-tangible way. Finally, I think I would stress the business-to-business relationship. In some ways, the biggest driver of the Indian economic growth story after 1991 was the rise of the services sector in India. And in some ways, this is both a gift and a curse, but India has evolved economically in a manner that many of the other Asian economies did not, which they basically focused on investment and human capital that led to a boost in manufacturing, which led to a boost in often low-skilled labor, that led to a boost in manufacturing, that led to a boost of exports. And that was the cycle by which a lot of Asian economies climbed out of from lower income to higher income brackets. India's rise has been very different. It's been driven primarily by services and consumption. And in some ways, the catalyst for that was a very strange set of things. It was some policy changes that took place in the late 80s and early 90s. It was the pre-existence of a large body of, comparatively large body of English-speaking skilled entrepreneurial engineers. And it was also the demand side, particularly starting in the US. Increasingly now it's being diversified to places like Europe and Australia and the Gulf and Southeast Asia. But that demand for those skills was what actually led to the major boost after, particularly after 1998 in the Indian services industry. So again, the formal metrics of how you measure a bilateral economic relationship tend to understate the importance of the India-US economic relationship to the two countries. So, I think this is what we're looking at. We have a steadily more cooperative relationship with the US, a steadily more competitive relationship with China. Of course, it is more complicated than that. I mean, I think there remain elements of significant cooperation with China. I would say climate change remains one, at least for the near-term future, public health remains another. But still financing mechanisms, India works with China on some of them. By the same token, there are areas of considerable difference between India and the US. These extend to trade. There's still no conclusion between a sort of so-called phase one trade deal between India and the United States that has been pending for some time. There remain differences of views particularly on Russia, but also on Iran and to some extent on Afghanistan as well. And so these tend to bleed into the overall relationship and tend to affect sometimes adversely Indian plans for, say, defense procurement from Russia or energy security in its dealings with Iran. But at the same time, I think if you look at the balance, you have a largely cooperative relationship with the US, which has these important differences. Whereas with China, you have a largely competitive relationship, which has some important areas of collaboration. So let me end on that note. I think this is what we are seeing emerge. And we can only use the past as a guide to the future, with the foreknowledge that things will change sometimes in some unexpected ways. But if we look at the trends we've seen over the last 5, 10, 20 years, it points to a future in the next 5, 10, 20 years where we're seeing this kind of relationship emerge. And this will have very real consequences, I think, for people in India, whether it's what app you use, what phone you buy, what car you drive. Two, increasingly, what kind of educational opportunities are there, what kind of employment opportunities are there. And this is what will be affected ultimately by India's relationship with China and the United States. So I'll end on that note. I see that there are already many questions, and I look forward to trying to take as many as I can in the time that we have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. To briefly summarize, you have very, very insightfully given us a broad perspective of the various aspects of dynamic relations that India and China have enjoyed since independence, and the same goes with US, and how that has come to affect our lives per se, and the bilateral relationships between these both countries, and what are the questions that we should be concerned about and contemplating on for future discourse. So moving on to the questions. So the first question is by Tushmi, and she wants to know what's your perspective on India banning Chinese apps, and does it kind of promote or indicate a sense of protectionism from the Indian end after what happened after India opened up its economy in the late 90s? Is it reverting back to some kind of protectionism?
So, I think the debate is only just getting started in India on that issue, which is, what does the economy of the near future look like? For the time being, I think there is a unity of purpose amongst two very different schools of thought. There is one school of thought that is truly protectionist and remains so. We hear voices from that on the right, political right, but equally there are voices on the left as well who believe in that India should be as autarkic as possible, and that it has not benefited from open trade policies and liberalization policies. There's a second school of thought, I think, that is broadly in favor of trade and openness, international economic openness. Again, both on the right and the left, and I think they've been champions in both major political parties to this in this respect. But who believe that the relationship with China in particular is not characterized by a level playing field, and that China's economic policies are actually have been harmful to India because it has protected its markets, because it provides large subsidies to its companies that make Indian competitors non-competitive. That it's guilty of dumping, often via third countries and so forth. So at this point of time, I think there is a unity of purpose between both those schools of thought, who both believe that India needs to take measures to protect its economy, and sometimes on national security grounds, so protect the country from Chinese economic influence. The app ban is part of that, because I think there's a realization that it's not just the trade in goods, which today is what dominates the India-China economic relationship, but in the near future, it will be it will really be control of the technological sector that will be the value, the major driver of growth for the next decade or two. So in some ways, while the things like the app ban will not have an immediate effect on the economy, I mean, there'll be some value loss for the Chinese companies. The longer term effect will be much, of India closing its market, its technological market to China, will have a major effect for those Chinese companies' global activities. It's also had a replication effect. So after India did that, you saw Australia starting to consider that. The US has now openly considered banning certain Chinese apps on national security grounds. So it's in some ways opened up a Pandora's box for others as well. So again, we still, I think, over the next year, particularly after India recovers from COVID, we will see a debate intensify, I think, as to what exactly does self-reliance mean. Can India have self-reliance? Is it seeking a truly sort of autarkic reversion to a pre-1991 type of era? And there's some people who would like to see that happen. Equally, I think there are others who say, listen, we just need to rebalance the terms of our economic engagement. That is, India has not been a net beneficiary of some of the terms of its trade agreements to date, and that it should actually take a sort of firmer position on some of these. There was some hopeful remarks by the Prime Minister just a day or two ago when he was speaking to the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum, where he implied that, in fact, he was hoping for more openness. But I think the debate is still underway, and we'll have to see where it goes.
Thank you for your answer, sir. I think it also provides a very interesting perspective as far as self-reliance is concerned. So there are a string of questions which range around the effect that the upcoming US elections will have with the whole new emerging disputes and the emerging India-China trade issues around, like, what will be the actual impact of the presidential elections in US as far as the relations between India and China and India and US are concerned, and will the election of someone like Joe Biden or the re-election of Donald Trump have any effectual consequences on how the relations go forward in light of the current dispute?
Right. No, that's a good question. In some ways, there's a lot of attention being paid to that. I would put it this way, which is that I think India will directly not be affected as much as most other countries by the outcome of the election, in the sense that there is broad agreement, and mostly positive views on both the Republican and Democratic side, and both Joe Biden himself and Donald Trump himself, about the relationship with India. I contrast this, for example, with very different views they have when it comes to the alliances in Europe, about its major trade partners, relations with Mexico. These are countries that will be much more directly affected by the outcome of the election than India will be. That being said, I think two things. One, the indirect effects might be quite consequential. So again, while there's not a huge difference between Biden and Trump when it comes to India per se, there are differences when it comes to overall attitudes to trade, overall attitudes to China, overall attitudes to immigration, and so it's not about India policy. It will be about China. They'll have different views to China policy, different views on immigration policy, trade, on climate change, on those issues. So in those areas, India will be indirectly affected by the outcome of the election. Trump is obsessed with trying to minimize trade deficits, and India is one of the countries with which the US has a trade deficit. If Biden is elected, chances are they will not be so focused on that. Trump does not support a climate change agenda. Biden does. That if he's elected, there will be some emerging cooperation on that. On the other hand, I think Trump has made it quite clear where his China policy lies. On Biden, I think there's still some uncertainty. There are different voices amongst his advisors who have different views as to how the US should approach China, and so I think it's a question of degree as to how much, what kind of position it'll take on China, and as a consequence, how much to invest in an emerging partnership such as India. So I think that's the first point, that the indirect effects will be quite significant. Finally, I think each candidate offers some issues on the agenda that, from an Indian point of view, I think we can see as a positive, and some issues that we can see as a negative. So I think for Trump, I think the broadly in favor of a closer strategic relationship with India. We've seen a loosening of technological controls, an increase of the defense, the military to military relationship. That is all, I think will continue to go in a more positive way. On the other hand, if Trump is reelected, I think we will see a particular focus on immigration, and this will affect, say, potentially Indian students to the US, but certainly Indian H-1B workers, non-immigrant workers, and green cards, Indians who are trying to naturalize into the US. So it'll make it much harder for a lot of Indians who are currently waiting to be processed, hopeful to be processed, for that to happen. Biden administration will not do that, most likely. So I think the immigration is one area. I think Donald Trump re-election would make it much harder for the India-US relationship. Trade, I think, will be. I think that the differences there are more surmountable, but we will see a much more aggressive push on trade as well. So I think that's on one side. On the Biden side, I think there are issues many people have flagged, I think somewhat overstated, but very much real, about scrutiny about the internal affairs of other countries, particularly the state of pluralism and human rights. It won't just be in India. I think China is already bearing the brunt of it. Just a day or two ago, yesterday, I believe, Joe Biden issued a statement on Tibet. So China, I think, will bear the brunt of it, but so will a lot of democratic countries, and again, not just India, the Philippines, Indonesia, Poland. I mean, the whole range of countries. So I think that will be an issue. I think sometimes, again, there's a tendency to overstate how much that will be central to a Democrat's foreign policy. On the other hand, I think we will see much more cooperative relationships on trade, the international economy, climate change, immigration, a number of issues in the bilateral relationship. We may also see a bit of a easing of, say, on Iran, which was a country that India, does have a relationship with. I think one wild card is the attitude towards Russia, which I think seems to be hardening on both sides of the equation. And Russia remains a major defense partner for India. So I think that will be a bit of a wild card. So the conclusion is I think each offers certain areas of opportunity and certain areas where from an Indian point of view, we'll see greater challenges.
Thank you, sir, for your answer. So there's another question that relates to the fact that in light of the emerging pandemic, what is the extent to which do you think that India could attract the global supply chains out from China to the India? And what do you think has been the impetus of the government as far as this is concerned?
I think this is one area where there was a little bit of complacency in the past, and I don't just mean the past 1 or 2 years. I mean, in the, I've heard it for 15 years, where there was a belief that the Indian economy was large enough that the international community had no choice but to invest in India. And that it was only a natural progression given that you had some partial liberalization, that you dropped restrictions on FDI, that the world would come knocking at India's door. That I think those assumptions were always a little overstated and a little complacent. And I think only after the pandemic, where there will be a sort of desperate attempt by many countries to recover their economies, it'll be all the more necessary for India to make a more aggressive push to try and attract investment there to India. I think this is one area where the ball is very much in India's court, that we need to find ways to show that it is easy and attractive to do business in India. And while India does offer scale, which a lot of countries don't have, Vietnam, at this point of time, Vietnam is perhaps the emerging economy that is best placed to attract, if there's trade diversion out of mainland China. Vietnam is a 100 million person country. It is part of most of the major trading arrangements in the region, including TPP, including RCEP. It has, it's very well placed to integrate into global supply chains. But I think the concern is even a country like Vietnam has sort of limitations in terms of scale. Basically, it will be an uphill struggle for India to try and attract that, but it's certainly possible. What needs to be done? I think the agenda has been known for some time. The question is, often there's political resistance to achieving that. So can you make the regulatory process more transparent and more stable? Can you make taxation more attractive? Can you make the terms of lending easier? Can you make land acquisition easier? Is the requisite infrastructure in place in terms of power, in terms of roads, rail, ports? So I think that agenda has been known for some time. The question is, and I think India has been making progress in that. The direction has been positive. The question is it been positive enough? And that, I think, is, if you talk to any large business around the world, that is what they look for, is do you have attractive terms for us to come in, that we can take our investment out? That's sometimes hard to do. Is there human capital? Can we hire people? I think another issue, this will be a bit more long term, is whether India can offer the quality of life. So if you want to be part of the global economy, you have to expect that expatriates will want to move there. And if what are they looking for? They want places where there are good schools, where there's greenery, where there's no pollution, where there's and that's something that today a Singapore offers, or a Dubai offers, or a Hong Kong, or a Shanghai even. The question is, can that be in place to attract those kinds of people to India? So I think these are all the things. Most of this is known. It's not a surprise. These are demands, or these are requests that the global business community has been making to the Indian government for a long time. The question is, I think, actually implementing a lot of that, and there'll be a further need to do so in the post-coronavirus global economy.
Thank you, sir. So flowing from the very same discussion, while that is very much true, and India's impetus has been positive in that direction for almost all sectors of the economy, but there is a question as regards why are we reluctant to sell our homegrown defense equipments like BrahMos, Akash missile to other countries, and would this not actually help us in raising the funds to meet our own defense acquisitions from countries like the US and Russia?
Right. So I mean, I have a whole, if you want to, I have a whole paper called The Indigenization of Indian Defense. It's on the Brookings India website if you are interested in reading on this, because this is a question that I puzzled over for a long time, which is India has been on a quest for defense industrial self-reliance since the 1950s. Actually, it's been, you look at documents then, India is making the same objectives about self-reliance and defense then. And at times, India was actually doing quite well. India did indigenous fighter aircraft in the 1960s, well before Tejas. The question is, why are we still at a state where India is today the second largest defense importer of any country in the world? I think it's more complicated than that. I go into some of those complications in the paper. But basically, the big challenge is today, India's public sector defense companies do not produce anything, with a few exceptions, including BrahMos, and I'll get to that in a second. But by and large, India's public sector defense companies do not produce anything that the rest of the world wants to buy. It's not, it doesn't meet the quality standards that a lot of for export, and that's partly because they've been so reliant on the domestic market. The Indian domestic defense demands are so high that they've not been designing and with the intention to export. There are a few exceptions to that rule, but then you come down to an issue of cost. And the question then is, does India use it as aid? So, for example, one area which has been somewhat successful has been offshore patrol vessels, smaller Coast Guard and naval vessels, which India now produces a surplus of. And in some cases, there's a demand for it in countries like Maldives, Sri Lanka, Mauritius, Mozambique. But they struggle to find ways to pay for it. So sometimes it's through finding attractive lending terms, and this is what's actually happening. The lines of credit that are now being extended in defense to some of these countries. That's one way. The second is providing it purely as aid, which is the Indian government buys and gives. But finding ways now to make it attractive to these countries is one thing. That's even more so for advanced systems such as BrahMos, which is, while there's been interest by some countries, notional interest, the fact is they haven't put in a request to buy, partly because the cost is quite high, and very few countries actually can afford a complex system like that. So I think this is sometimes what it comes down to. It's very easy to say, listen, we want to export, but one is, are you producing things of a quality, and is it cost competitive? And that's something that hasn't really happened. The real story, I think, on the defense industry side is actually something different, which is the rise. And now, initially it was very reluctant, the rise of the private sector in the defense industry. But prior to the year 2000, there was no private sector defense players. Only recently has the government started to actively encourage the private defense industry by giving a contract, making it a more level playing field between the public and private sector. And so what we've started to see happen is in private sector Indian defense companies getting not into producing major systems, which they don't have the knowledge or technology to do, but are actually integrating into the supply chains for larger defense firms. So you have Bharat Forge, L&T, Tata's, I mean, a number of other companies that I can name that today are very actively working in joint ventures with some of the global defense companies to produce components in India for export to third markets. I mean, just to give one example, you have components manufactured in India for F-16 aircraft, which are flown by many militaries around the world, which India does not fly. India doesn't have F-16s, but you have components for F-16s now being produced in India for the global market by private companies in joint ventures with foreign firms. So in some ways there's a much more organic process underway on the defense industrial side, and so I think we will see a boost of a natural increase in the Indian defense exports in that area. Whether we can actually see completely indigenous designed platforms being exported will depend very much on whether Indian companies, whether public or private, can make them in surplus and make them globally competitive, both from a quality perspective and from a cost perspective.
Thank you, sir. So another question that flows from one of the elements of India-China relations that you discussed before is that what steps do you think should India take to counter China's influence over Nepal, extending to even to the African regions? And will groups like ASEAN and SAARC be helpful for India to counter China's expansionist policies in the coming years?
So on that one, look, Chinese influence takes multiple forms. Generally, it started with economic influence in most places. So it's using China's sort of newfound ability to extend large-scale project assistance. Although the terms of that financing are often quite opaque, so we don't know whether it's grant aid, loans, what the terms of those loans are, sometimes are hidden from public scrutiny. But in any case, China is extending a large amount of financing around the world, in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, Central Eastern Europe, Central Asia. I mean, so it's happening everywhere. Sometimes that economic assistance and that trade dependency is being leveraged for political objectives. This is quite natural. Every country does that. China now has a newfound ability to do that. So we're seeing that happen in several places, but China is because it has become, in some cases, the most important external economic partner for some smaller countries, or at least one of the most important economic partners. It now has a much greater political role to play. In a few cases, I mean, this is still rare, but it's happening. It's translating that political influence into security influence. You see this in Djibouti. I mean, Djibouti is the most overt example of that. Pakistan, although nature is a bit different. But so you are seeing China now leverage its economic and subsequently political influence into security influence. With a few countries in South Asia, though, this pattern it's not flowed in that order. It has been the reverse. So with Pakistan and Bangladesh, the China relationship was first a military relationship, a military-to-military relationship that has now become more economic. With Nepal, it's different. With Nepal, actually, the economic relationship isn't as pronounced, and the security relationship even less so. But it has been primarily political, which is the communist parties in Nepal have links and ties to the Communist Party in China. So I think it's a very different nature. And we've also seen a growth in Nepali nationalist sentiment as well, often directed against India. So it plays well in Nepal's politics to strike a sort of strident anti-India tone, and we saw this recently over in the map dispute issue between the two countries. So the question is how to deal with it. I think Nepal is in some ways in a different category of its own, just because it's a very sort of special relationship with India. There's an open border. There's the level of interdependency is much greater, and sometimes that makes it harder to actually for India to communicate its unhappiness with certain things that the Nepali government is doing, because the only measures that can be taken tend to be quite quite strident, it's very hard to have a sort of a more nuanced policy. But I think that's what the two countries are trying to strive towards. So in the midst of all the differences, the public differences between India and Nepal, you are actually seeing a lot of cooperation on the ground when it comes to on hydropower, on connectivity between the two countries. So I think I would put Nepal in a slightly different category. I think in Africa it's very different, and I think partly the direct concerns for India are less, the political concerns are less, but in some ways that actually gives India a freer hand. And so you've seen India extend about $13 billion of loans to sub-Saharan African countries. The single largest recipient is Tanzania. And while that is only about 1/13th, 1/12th, 1/13th of what China has done, I think one could make a case that it's been much more effective and efficient in the sense that it's actually gone towards projects that have more of a direct impact on the local economy or local governance structures. Many of these actually don't get very much attention in India. So just to give an example, I was doing a lecture in Delhi to some visiting diplomats from the Gambia, a country I know very little about. So in preparation, I was doing my homework and what's going on in India-Gambia relations. I didn't realize that India is actually financing their largest port, an expansion of their largest port, and building their parliament building. And when I mentioned this to the Gambian diplomats, they said, "Oh yeah, of course, everybody knows that. We're very grateful to India." But it's not something that would ever make news in India. So I think there's a lot that is going on. The major difference, of course, is India is much more resource constrained than China. China has an economy that's 5 times the size. So the idea that India has the ability to go sort of one-to-one with China outside its neighborhood, outside its immediate neighborhood, I think is simply impossible. The question is, can you direct the limited resources you have more efficiently and effectively to achieve the objectives that you would like to achieve? So, again, there's a lot underway, security assistance, training, it's hard to actually catalog all of the activities that are underway. And now this is starting very slowly, but it's now also involving the private sector in India in ways. So you have Indian NGOs that are now getting financing from the Indian government to support capacity building efforts in other countries. So just to give one example, there's an institution in Rajasthan where they train women in solar energy. And they now have modules that they do in different countries. I think have at least dozens of countries, from Papua New Guinea to Latin America, where they have now started taking those skills. And what they do is they train trainers so that people locally can train other people as well. So this is an example. I think it's a private initiative, a non-governmental initiative, which has the support of the Indian government, but which is having an impact around the world, in the developing world. So I think that these are the kinds of things that are India's relative strengths. But the idea that I think that India should emulate exactly what China is doing would be both wasteful and counterproductive.
Thank you, sir. Tracing back the discussion to India and the US, what do you think are the pros and cons of visualizing the Quad as a security-based alliance like NATO? Mm-hmm. And after Abe's exit and possible Biden win, can Quad actually secure the Indo-Pacific and increasingly adventurous China?
Right. That's a good question, and I think there's a lot. I'm actually writing something about this now because there's a lot of misconceptions about the Quad, and sometimes I fear deliberate misconceptions by people who are critical or skeptical of the Quad. Two parts to your question. On the first part, can it be an Asian NATO? And I think no. The simple reason being that NATO itself grew out of a very specific context and with a very specific purpose. So it grew out of the Atlantic Charter and the North Atlantic Treaty that was signed, and was very much an overt military alliance in the wake of World War II to counter the spread of communism. So it had a very specific context and a specific agenda. And honestly, if you were to have designed NATO in the 90s or 2000s from scratch, it would not look like what it does today. It has evolved, it has expanded, but it was meant to fulfill a certain purpose. The context for the Quad, emergence of the Quad, is is quite different. The challenge is different. The time is different. The nature of international relations today is quite different from the immediate post-World War II context. So I don't think that that's a very good analogy to look at what is happening amongst the Quad countries. Is it going to be, I'll actually get to the second part and then in some ways back to the first part. Is it going to be sufficient to counter a rising China and a more aggressive China? I would say no. It's a necessary but insufficient ingredient. That is, the Quad by itself, that is and I should define the Quad, which is the increasing cooperation we're seeing amongst these four countries: the US, Japan, India, and Australia. Their growing defense cooperation is in some ways a natural and necessary step. These are four large, capable, democratic, large economies that have the resources and the capability and will to challenge some of China's assertive behavior. But in and of itself, that will be insufficient, in fact. So it's only a matter of time before, I think what is happening is again, a natural progression. The four Quad countries are actually doing things bilaterally with each other that they were not doing 10, 15 years ago on a defense front. So let me just give the example of India and Australia, because they're sometimes seen as the weakest link in the Quad. But today they have a 2+2 dialogue amongst the foreign and defense ministers. The first one is going to be held soon. It was announced recently. They just signed a logistics agreement, which allows the two to resupply and replenish, the two militaries to resupply and replenish each other. Australia provides real-time inputs on maritime domain awareness to India on a daily basis. There's a real-time link between the two countries. They held their first major anti-submarine warfare exercises in the Bay of Bengal a year and a half ago, a year or two ago. So AUSTINDEX. These are very significant developments for two countries that historically had almost no defense contacts, at least prior to the 1990s. In some ways, there's this obsession about including Australia in the Malabar quadrilateral, trilateral exercises to make them a quadrilateral exercise. That may happen. That may happen soon, but that's almost that's minor compared to these other changes that we're witnessing just in the last few years in terms of defense cooperation between two countries, and developments that will have real significance for the two countries' joint ability to play a security role in the Indian Ocean, particularly the Eastern Indian Ocean. So this is, I think, what is actually emerging. And a similar story can be told on the India-Japan relationship, the India-US relationship, even more so, the Japan-Australia relationship. So each of the bilateral and trilateral relationships is getting tighter, is getting closer. But I think it's also important to stress that the Quad is not and should not be seen as an exclusive concept. It's a basis, but you can see cooperation emerging below that level amongst two or three of those countries, but also above that level. And I'll point quickly to just a few initiatives that are actually underway. One is Australia. You may have seen the news, but Australia, Japan, and India have started discussions on a supply chain resilience initiative, and have said in their joint statement, which was just in the last few days, that they hope other countries can join. So it's quite possible the US will join after the elections. And not to mention other Southeast Asian or other countries as well. The four countries are all part of a dialogue on what's referred to as a Quad Plus dialogue that meets regularly now virtually, that also involves South Korea, Vietnam, and New Zealand. They are part of another dialogue that involves Brazil, Israel, and South Korea as well. All four countries are part of what's known as the D10 initiative to discuss 5G, which is 10 democratic countries. This was a British-led proposal. All four countries are part of a global GPay, a global program on artificial intelligence, which is being set up. That's a French-Canadian-led initiative. So you are seeing in some ways the Quad as a sort of common thread amongst a number of emerging areas of increasing importance: supply chains, artificial intelligence, 5G, amongst public health as well. And so I think we have to start thinking of the Quad as a sort of much more flexible arrangement than NATO is. It's necessary for these 4 countries to come together and have share their views and increase coordination amongst each other. But is that going to be a sufficient for balancing in Asia? Arguably not. I think it has to be built upon further.
Thank you so much, sir. So how many more questions will you be able to take?
I can go for another half an hour. So,
all right. All right, sir. We'll ask accordingly. So Shreya has a question: whether what are your views regarding the necklace of diamonds strategy of India, and in light of the present situation, what all does India need to do to increase the influence of this strategy to counter China in the region? Along with that, she also wants to know whether do you think that India should rethink its contribution to BRICS, majorly towards the new development bank in which it almost holds 20% of the shareholding?
Sure. So first of all, there's no official policy of necklace of diamonds. I think that's something coined by some. It must have been coined by a journalist or analyst. There's no official policy to that effect. I think it might be a reference to what was called the string of pearls, which was again not an actually official Chinese strategy or policy at all. That was something that a U.S. consulting firm called China's policy of in major port investment in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, and basically with the intention of that having strategic implications for China, increasing China's overall strategic reach. So that was dubbed a string of pearls. That name caught on. Many people described it as such. It was used to describe Chinese port investment in Chokphew, Chittagong in Bangladesh, Hambantota in Sri Lanka, Colombo, Karachi, Gwadar, Djibouti, and so forth. The fact is the relationships that China has with each of those ports is very different from each other. There's not a single policy that governs all of them. But it very much, the fact that it does have many of these projects do have a significant strategic consequence. It should not be understated. So just a bit of a corrective there. What we are seeing India do is different in different places. So in some cases, you're seeing India, I think there are 2 cases where India has actually invested successfully in a port. One is Chabahar, which is in Iran, which is a container port. With the idea of eventually, at some point, using that as a basis for connectivity, north-south connectivity into the Central Asian hinterland. That is going to be complicated by a number of things, including US sanctions on Iran being one, but also the security conditions in Afghanistan and Central Asia. So that's a long-term thing. There is a container port there, but sometimes its significance tends to be sometimes overstated. The second somewhat successful Indian port project has been in Sitwe in Myanmar. And there the significance is that will connect, hopefully, into Mizoram and into Northeast India. So it provides an avenue for Northeast India to actually, which is landlocked currently, and sometimes has to be supplied via Calcutta, which is much more expensive and roundabout. It gives it much more direct access to the sea. And that has been complicated, I think, by the situation in Rakhine province in Myanmar. So, it's been very adverse conditions under which India has developed a port there. And that's more than a container port. That's meant to be much more. The connectivity project linking that port to Mizoram has been complicated. The Kaladan multimodal project has been complicated and delayed and ran into some significant problems. Some of it actually on the Indian side. But these have been 2 sort of semi-successful cases of Indian port development. There are other cases where, it's not the means that India can deploy, but certainly in cooperation with others. So there's some hope for developing, say, in Colombo, in other ports, in joint collaboration with other countries. India adding some components to the infrastructure in that area. But I think we have to keep in mind that India has limited means and doesn't have the port capacity in India is still hamstrung. This has not been one area where India has major surplus capacity and know-how. So I think one is sort of working with other countries in sort of joint projects, and that opens up certain avenues of possibility. The other thing is, I think there's some developments on the security front, particularly with the Indian Ocean Island countries, where India is actually playing a much more direct role. But that has a much more direct security context. That's not a commercial. That's not a commercial initiative. But I think what you've seen happen basically is India using a variety of. I would say there's a sort of third element to this policy, which is also just simply getting access to Chinese ports. And Bangladesh is a good example of that, where China has financed some of the port projects, but Bangladesh has been relatively transparent about giving access and transparency to others, including India, which has helped to mitigate some of the potential security concerns that India and others had about the consequences of Chinese investment in those ports. So I think a combination of transparency, competing projects in countries that are friendly, and where it's possible, working with third countries in cases where India does not have the requisite resources or know-how, is a way where India can actually address this issue about growing concern about the security consequences of Chinese investment in ports.
Thank you, sir. So Aniket Singh has a question that Anand Krishnan of the Brookings Institution noted that the increasing influence of trade and investment as the driving force of normalization of relations. And would any form of limiting investment by Chinese firms in Indian market be compensated by the West in light of the increasing anti-globalization movement in the West? And why do countries like Bangladesh and Vietnam benefit more from companies exiting China than as compared to India?
Yep. So, and two related questions. So, Anant was writing at a time before, one it was before coronavirus, before the current boundary standoff, and noted, I think quite accurately, that Indian tech companies were receiving sizable amounts of investment from China, particularly Alibaba and Tencent. Those two accounted for the majority of those investments, but others as well. And in fact, even, and as Anant described it, I think correctly, this even understated Chinese figures, because a lot of it was being routed through third countries such as Singapore or other places. So we were starting to see a growing Chinese investment in the Indian tech sector. Again, this should have been a good thing. That on balance is mostly a good thing. The concerns, and Anant flagged this in his paper as well, was there a process on the Indian side to make sure that this did not compromise national security in any way? And many countries, including the US, have a process when there is an outside investor, that they seek, what is the control of the holding company, how independent is it, if they were to pull investment or direct control over the organization of the investment destination, would that have any national security consequences? So there is a process in many countries, and India has not fully developed that process yet, although I think there's some amendments to that being considered now. In some ways, what happened is, because of the boundary crisis, you saw India reacting with a much blunter instrument, and I think that has political. There's a political driver for that now, which is simply to ban the app, and that will disincentivize investment. But I think moving forward, assuming the crisis is in some ways overcome, the boundary issue, it is a good idea for India in general to develop a process for screening investments that is relatively, transparent about the process, but which actually takes into account national security concerns, so that. And not just applied to China, by the way. I think this should probably be a sort of universal trend. And the process ideally should be something that does not deter investment from any country, but which is able to accurately block anything that raises red flags. It's unlikely that a SoftBank, which is a Japanese firm, investing into the tech sector would raise the same red flags as a Tencent. But ideally, everyone should go through the same process at least, and it should not be so onerous and so complicated that people say, listen, I'm just giving up and not investing in the Indian tech sector. So I think that was really the sort of the sum and substance of what Anant was getting at, I think, in his paper for Brookings India. On the second part of that question on BRICS, I think BRICS again came about at a particular time immediately after the global financial crisis. That's when the first BRICS summit was held, although it had been in shape before 2008. And this idea of a new development bank came about simply because the four and then five countries were equally frustrated by lack of reform in the IMF and World Bank, the major the Bretton Woods institutions, where India and China in particular had a small share in the votes relative to their growing economy. So these were arrangements that were ironed out during the Cold War era, and China joined the World Bank in the 70s, India earlier, and basically the US was not. And to some extent Europe were not really being accommodating, and Japan, by the way, on the Asian Development Bank, were not really being as accommodating. And this came to the fore in the wake of the global financial crisis, where it was perceived that the major culprits were the US and then Europe. So the BRICS kind of grew out of that, and the idea of the new development bank made sense at the time, and all five countries had a roughly equal say and share in the process. I think it's reached its limitations for a number of reasons, partly because China itself sees that there are limitations to it, right? So China now no longer wants to have 1/5 of the share and an equal amount as, roughly equal say as South Africa or Brazil, or let alone India. And that's why we saw in some ways the AIIB also being formulated, where China plays a leading role. India is the second largest shareholder, but which is much more inclusive, and is also trying to meet certain standards that were set by the World Bank as well. So in that sense, that's why we see these two organizations come. Does it make sense for India to pull out? Arguably no. In fact, India, by some accounts, has been the largest recipient of AIIB funding to date. These are institutions where India has a disproportionately high say and share, but they're also, I think BRICS in particular will be somewhat stunted by the conditions of its rise, which is the five countries, and it came about in a particular time when it made sense, but where China particularly has been more disinterested in its evolution. So I'm not sure pulling out of BRICS or AIIB gets anything for India. I'm not sure it benefits in any concrete way. But again, a lot of it will depend on what we see happen in India-China relations going forward. Already, we've seen things happen that I think people had thought were impossible a few years ago.
Thank you, sir. On the economic front, Anirudh has a question that in the last 1 year, it appears that the government is trying to shift towards a saving investment export model followed in Southeast Asia, from different from a services and domestic consumption model that you talked about right now. So do you think that the government has taken sufficient steps in that direction?
I don't think. I think this has been an uphill struggle. That is, there has been a desire. In some ways, again, the Indian economic growth story has been different. Critics would say it's put the cart before the horse. Others would say it's just sui generis model. It's grown in a different way. But I think there has been acknowledgement that at some stage you also have to fill that missing middle. That there is. You have lower wage earners who have basic skills, who could be much more productive and could be employed much more productively, and particularly in the manufacturing sector. So I think there is that, again, there has been that acknowledgement for some time that something that India could do and should be doing. Has enough been done? I think the results speak for themselves, which is you don't yet have that manufacturing and employment on scale that you've seen in other places, and that hasn't lifted enough people into the middle class or the upper middle class as it has in parts of Southeast Asia and certainly mainland China. So, I think the reasons for that are several-fold. External factors do play a role. This is where the economic and trade relationship with China comes into play. Sometimes it's overstated, but there are serious allegations of dumping by China, which has stunted in some ways Indian manufacturing. But it's not only the external factors. I think internal factors also play a role, which is India has to do much more to make itself an attractive manufacturing powerhouse. And I mentioned some of the issues, again, that are well known. I mean, it's ease of doing business, land acquisition, labor, skills, infrastructure, and so forth. So that all needs to be done. I would end on a slightly more optimistic note, which is I think a lot of that is now down to states, and you're seeing different states moving at different speeds. Some, particularly the southern and western states, have moved much closer. I mean, if you take the per capita GDP of the five big southern states and Maharashtra and Gujarat, it's actually higher than a lot of the middle income Southeast Asian countries. So we're seeing in some ways, and again, there are both positives and negatives to this, which is it's good to see some states pushing forward and rushing ahead and industrializing much more successfully. On the downside, I think that's creating more disparities within the country, and that is something that will have political consequences down the road. So, and the long and short of it is, is India as a whole moving fast enough in that direction? Probably not. But certainly some states seem to be moving much, much faster than others.
Thank you, sir. Sir, Avnish Singh wants to know that what kind of foreign news and policy sources do you refer and rely on to keep yourself regularly updated?
I get that question quite a lot, and I wish that I could offer a series, a quick list of things that I... Unfortunately, I found the state of the media, particularly covering international news, has become so bad. And this is unfortunate. It used to be, when I started off 15 years ago in this career, if you will, and at that time, there were three major American publications on four major American publications on foreign affairs. There were, 5-6 Indian newspapers. There were limited sources where you go, and I also found, quite selfishly, when I wrote in the Indian Express, everybody read it. Today, when I write something in the Indian Express or Hindustan Times, a lot of people miss it, and that's just because the nature of media consumption has changed so much. I'm not saying it's only a bad thing. In some ways, it's good to see alternative voices coming to the fore. It's good to see the greater diversity. But it's been much harder to ensure that there are consistent platforms where to shape conversations where you can have kind of quality discussions on certain issues. So again, I wish I could say that these are the 3-4 publications you have to read. Again, 15 years ago, I might have been able to list these are 10 must-read publications, but today I don't think anyone quite fits the bill. And a problem is increasingly also because of the business models. A lot of them are going behind paywalls, making them even less accessible, particularly to non-specialists. So, and for somebody like me who does not make a living out of writing, not paid by the article, I would rather write for a publication that is open access and gets read much more by people than to elite publication that is behind a paywall that I know will only be read by a smaller grouping of people. So that's also changed in some ways how you write as well. So I wish there were a few. I mean, I'd say all the major publications I sometimes find good articles, sometimes and useful, informed, analytical pieces. A lot of the same publications I sometimes find 90% of it is nonsense, polemical stuff that is very thin and sometimes downright erroneous. I mean. So the quality varies significantly even within publications. One tip I would suggest, and this is something I do, is I use social media to follow people whose views I respect. And oftentimes, if I find several people sharing an article, not just one, but several people saying, "Oh, this is really great. You have to read it." That makes it more likely that I will read it. And so sometimes, basically, I use other people via social media as a screen to help me focus on, because everybody has limited time, you can't read everything, to focus on things that are creating a wave, or things that are good, content that is good. So that, I think, is a useful trend. Find people you respect, and sometimes also your opinion changes. So somebody who puts out a lot of promotes a lot of useless content, you tend to not take them as seriously. So I found social media can be if used well, if used smartly, can be a good screening mechanism to find good news and views and analysis from around the world.
Thank you, sir. Moving on to the last question, which directly relates to the answer that you have given, I would like to ask Anirudh to ask the question to you directly.
So, so in the Indian domestic scenario, there is this impression that the coverage of India in mainstream US media is very negative, and particularly we see that in the recent events that have happened in the past 1 to 2 years, the coverage in Western media has been negative. And we also saw how the External Affairs Minister he went and gave interviews to think tanks. When he went to US, he gave interviews to think tanks instead of the media publications. So what do you think is the reason for this negative coverage, and what are the steps that are being taken to ensure that the soft power and the media coverage of India is positive?
Right. I mean, I answered this question to some degree in a Reddit conversation a few months ago on foreign media coverage. I think of it this way: it's a bit different than it's often seen from India, which is, frankly, the US media does not care about international affairs. I mean, the international affairs coverage in the mainstream US media is minimal. In fact, it may have even gone down over time, which is strange and surprising. When articles are written about India, by and large, I mean, with few exceptions, they are mostly today read by people outside of the US. They're not read by people in the US. Again, frankly, most people in the US don't care about the world. Those that do care about the world don't care that much about India. It's sort of, there's a broadly positive view about India, and but a lot of non-strong views about it all. There is a small community of people who do care about India, Indian Americans, a few others. They sometimes monitor developments carefully. But barring them, most of the audience today is outside of India. I think there are biases. Every institution, every individual, every publication has inherent biases. There are some of that is reflected in some of these publications. Certain types of news tends to play well. So I've pointed out, I think, that things that play to people's stereotypes tends to play. There's a story about monkeys every year or two in monkeys in India in the US press. The stories about cows, stories about people have what some people have called poverty porn. I mean, so some of that is just sort of stereotyping, and that plays well with editors. Sometimes editorial boards simply don't know the difference. The people they interact with all think a certain way. There's a lot of groupthink. So there's a resistance to voices that genuinely offer alternative perspectives. Sometimes, some that they might find disagreeable, but which are still have a lot of resonance in other countries. So, finally, I think the business model is also quite toxic, which is when somebody writes what is seen as an offensive article to many Indians, it's actually Indian clicks that drive. Sometimes it's hate clicks, but it's Indian audiences that drive attention to that piece. And so from an advertising point of view, they say, oh, this piece got lots of clicks. I mean, so sometimes that also drives decisions about content. And, if you see, for example, who are regular columnists at certain publications, it's because they have a profile that brings in a large international audience. So, I think these are the factors that are often driving what we are seeing. The question, I think, is that, how much of it actually affects people's attitudes and decision making? And some of it does, for sure. I think for example, business news gets a lot of its cues from the business media, which is seen as much more objective, even when it's not. So, positive stories about ease of doing business in India would play well. Negative stories would play badly. But I think beyond a point, I don't think it's people are going. This is my personal view, but I think it's worth engaging with anybody who is open-minded about things and is willing to look at different perspectives, even if they continue to disagree. But if people are really set in their ways, and a lot of people are, beyond a point, and I always try and engage with everybody, but I think beyond a point, that is diminishing value in trying to make a case to about an issue to somebody who is very firmly set in their ways. And by the way, that applies not just in the US. I think that applies in India as well. So anyway, so I think that's really in some ways what's going on. I don't think it's sometimes it's not instinctive anti-Indianism per se that's at play. It's sometimes other biases at work. Again, I think I know a lot of the foreign correspondents in India personally, and a lot of them are not don't hate India or dislike India. They've chosen to live there, and some of them have lived there lived in India for quite a long time. But sometimes I know they have trouble pitching certain kinds of stories to their editors that just don't think it's not value, whereas other stories play much better.
Thank you so much, sir. With that answer, we approach the end of this session. We thank you a lot. And before finally ending it, I would like to invite Samarth to give a brief vote of thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yathansh. Now, as the co-convener of IDG, I take this chance to thank you, Dhruva Jaishankar sir, for joining us in these challenging times and sharing with us your expertise and thoughts. We are truly fortunate to have interacted with you and learned the nuances of the issues from your valuable experience. I would also like to thank all our participants who joined us and put up such wonderful questions and helped us make the session successful. Once again, thank you everyone, and thank you so much, sir, for gracing us with your presence.